All right, I appreciate everyone being here today. These events that have unfolded in Minneapolis have reverberated across the United States, and we feel the impacts of them here in the Police Bureau and in our community as well. I want to be clear that what we see as professional police officers in this video from Minneapolis does not represent in any way the values or the standards of our profession. We as a profession have worked very hard to overcome some of the problems that we know that we have in our relationships in our communities, and in particular in communities of color. And what we see in this incident to us really represents a big step in the wrong direction. As Lieutenant Jones said, we've received a lot of questions from all over our community about our training and our standards here in the Police Bureau. We've put out some information with some of that. I'm happy to answer questions about some of our training with regard to the issues that we see in this case. But really, for me to sit here today and just spell out all the things that we've done here in Portland to avoid an outcome like the one that we saw in this case, in some ways misses the point, because we just need to be real about the fact that in our profession we have a problem in our relationship with communities, particularly marginalized communities and communities of color. We've spent a lot of time and expended a lot of effort in this organization and in this city to move our organization and our profession beyond that. But we recognize, and an incident like this just underscores the responsibility that we have to continue that work and those efforts to provide the best possible police service for the communities that we serve. We support Chief Arredondo in Minneapolis and his decision to take swift action. That was an option that was available to him under their system in Minneapolis, and we joined the Major Cities Chiefs Association in their support of his decisions in that case. It's incumbent upon us as leaders in policing to hold our members accountable and to be decisive in circumstances like this. The last thing I want to say before we open it up for questions is that when things like this happen, there's a tendency for all of us in the police profession and in our communities to look at each other as if the community and the police are two different things, and they really aren't. That's the difference in policing in the United States, in a country governed by the rule of law. And that's very important to us, and we recognize, even here all the way across the continent in Portland, the impact that an event like this somewhere else in the country can have on us. But we've been a community policing agency for as long as community policing has existed, and we still believe in the value of community policing and in that idea that the police and the community are not two different things, that they're actually two parts of the same thing. So with that, I will open it up to questions if you have any.
So we'll give it just a second. I'm going to turn up the volume, and I know there's a little bit of a delay between the audio on the teleconference line. So do we have someone with a question for the chief?
I have a question. This is Alex with the Portland Mercury. Can you hear me?
I can.
It's a little faint, but go ahead.
Okay. You mentioned kind of comments on the video, which I'm assuming is the video of George Floyd, but I'm curious if you have any comments about the way that police officers responded to protests over the past couple of days in Minneapolis.
You know, not having been there, it's really hard for me to respond to that because it just depends on the circumstances that they're faced with. Protests activity just in general for police is a challenging thing for us to provide public safety service for. It can be because in protest situations, our role in those runs the gamut from not even being there to maybe providing for traffic control around a big event to keep people safe, to dealing with violence and civil disturbances. I'm not really familiar enough with exactly what it was they were faced with to say either way. I mean, it's certainly, it's what we're seeing happening is not good. Anytime we get into a situation where we have to use force in a protest situation, that's something we always want to avoid. But without a lot more specific information about the reasoning behind actions that the police department there took, I don't think it would be fair for me to weigh in on their tactics.
Is there another question for the chief?
I have one.
Can you state your name and your organization, please?
Yeah, this is Kay Rambo with the Oregonian. Kind of relating to protests in response to this event, how is the Portland Police Bureau preparing for the protests that are planned in Portland for the upcoming days?
That is a good question. And we prepare for these the same way we prepare for any time that we have protest events in Portland. First, we just find out as much information as we can about what's planned. Usually that involves trying to talk to organizers, and we'll take any information they want to give us about what their plans are, and then determine what, if any, role we need to have. And again, sometimes that's limited to things like traffic control at intersections, just to move large numbers of people across streets or those kind of things. Protests, policing and protests takes on a whole new dimension, though, when the protest is about the police. In general, we try not to be involved in those unless we absolutely have to, just because we recognize that the visible presence of police officers could be triggering for people. And so, you know, what we ask in these situations is that organizers try to manage their events really well, because what we obviously can't have is threats to public safety or large-scale property damage or any of those kind of things. But in our preparation for protests, we never start with the assumption that just because we're having a protest means that we're going to have some kind of criminal activity. Those are two different things. So in general, we don't like to get involved in those unless there's a really good reason for us to, because for some reason, you know, there's some kind of criminal activity. I will tell you that we have about 300 protest events in this city a year, the vast majority of which don't even require any meaningful police intervention or presence at all, because they're just exercises of people's constitutionally protected rights that don't involve anything else besides that. You know, we would really appreciate in times like this, we certainly support people's First Amendment rights to protest and to express themselves. You know, we took an oath to uphold the rule of law, and that's one of the rules of law. But what we would ask is that people do so in a way that does not impact other people's also protected rights, and that certainly that doesn't deteriorate into criminal activity, although I want to be really clear that we don't think that just because a protest is happening that means there's going to be criminal activity. Those are two completely different things.
Thank you, Chief. Is there another question for the Chief? I know sometimes it takes a second to unmute and there's a delay, so.
Yeah, I actually have a quick follow-up on that. Has there been any sort of concrete steps taken by PPB to change protest responses in a further effort to avoid violence that has been seen in prior protests?
Well, we're always changing our response and evolving our response to policing large events. Every time we have one of those events where there's a significant police presence, we learn something that we can do better next time, and we don't ever want to just say that we've arrived at the place where we're as good at this as we can get, and there's nothing we can do differently or better. So, I would say that whether or not there is violence in protests, we're always going to be evolving our tactics and our approach to these events to make sure we consistently get the best outcomes that we can in a way that respects people's rights. It's a very delicate balance for us in these situations because, when you say violence at protests, that can come from a lot of places. And, we have seen a trend over the last couple years in some protest events towards opposing factions showing up and being violent with each other. In those cases, if you're coming to Portland to protest, we think that's fine. That's a big part of the fabric of this city. And it is a really big part of what we value as Portlanders is that ability to come out in the public space and say what you think. If you're coming here because you want to hurt other people or you want to destroy property or commit crimes, obviously we can't have that because that creates an unsafe environment for everyone else. And, the challenge for us in these situations is always to avoid the violence or any kind of criminal activity while not reducing people's ability to just come out and exercise their constitutional right.
Is there another question for the chief?
I have another. This is Alex with the Mercury. Just another kind of follow-up to potential protests. I'm curious. I know that there are some limitations just in the county around social distancing, and I'm curious kind of what, to an extent, officers intend on upholding social distancing rules and handling protests when there are some requirements around health and safety.
And there are those requirements right now, but the police aren't always the most appropriate way to ensure compliance with those social distancing and other requirements that are designed to avoid the spread of COVID. We are certainly aware that issue is out there, but in our approach to something like a protest over something that happened with the police, I don't believe that it's really appropriate for us in that situation to go out and do a lot of really strict enforcement of social distancing guidelines and face mask guidelines and those kinds of things. We would ask that people observe those because that is for everyone's benefit and everyone's safety. Whether we're police officers or protesters or members of the community, we're all human and we are all at risk to getting sick right now in this pandemic. And so, we would add our voices to those of the county health authorities and city government, really asking people to observe good, safe social distancing and other hygiene guidelines when they're engaged in protest activity. That's one of the things that I saw in Minneapolis was it looked like some of the organizers were trying to get people to observed those guidelines and they were being mindful of that, that's the more appropriate way to get compliance with that than us sending police officers in to make arrests or issue citations or anything like that. We do take the social distancing guidelines seriously, but we also have to balance that need for people to observe those with the need to get us through a really highly emotionally charged event in the right way with a good outcome. And so I don't see where there's going to be a lot of benefit in us going out and performing law enforcement on social distancing guidelines.
Was there another question for the chief? Okay, I don't want to disappoint someone if they're fiercely trying to hit unmute on their phone. So, well, Chief Davis, we really appreciate you taking the time today. And, if media has further questions, I know we put out a lot of information today, but this was an important topic with a lot of questions that were asked. So, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.